Hey guys, PP97 here, and it's time for me to do another rant. This rant was requested by Maruigi2, and I'm more than happy to do this rant because it's a topic that I'm familiar with. So let's get going. Video games have left a huge impact on kids since the 1980s. However, one thing that could really piss off a lot of gamers is when the Japanese releases of video games differ from the American releases. Here are some examples. The original Super Mario Bros. Was released in Japan in 1985 and in America in 1986. The year it was released in America, Super Mario Bros. 2 was released in Japan, but it didn't make it overseas until much later. In 1987, Japan released a game called Doki Doki Panic. When this game came to America, it was hacked and the characters were changed to Mario characters, and it was called Super Mario Bros. 2. This game was released in America in 1988, which is ironically the same year Super Mario Bros. 3 was released in Japan. The real Super Mario Bros. 2 wasn't released in America until 1993, and it was for the Super Nintendo. Another thing that could be frustrating about the Japanese versions of games is when they get games that never make an American release at all. If you're familiar with the Angry Video Game Nerd, you probably know about some of these. For example, a Godzilla Tournament Fighter game was meant to be made for the Super Nintendo in 1995, but it was only released in Japan, and the only Godzilla games we got in America were crappy games. The same thing also happened with the Back to the Future games. It is bittersweet to know that Japan got all these awesome games and left us with crap. However, not all Japanese-only games were good. A good example would be Transformers. Back in the mid-80s, when the Transformers were at the peak of their popularity, you would expect there to be a video game for it on the NES. Well, there was one, but it was only released in Japan, and it never came to the States because, well, they thought it was too hard for American gamers, which is the same reason for Super Mario Bros. 2. The worst thing about this issue with Japanese and American releases of games is when there's a series of games, but not all the games in the series are released in the United States. For example, The Goonies is one of the greatest movies of the 80s. A Goonies video game was released for the Famicom, but only in Japan. There was a sequel to this game called Goonies 2, but this game did make an American release. What I don't understand is why we got Goonies 2 in America but not Goonies 1. It doesn't make any sense. Not to mention the movie never had a sequel, so what's the point? The prime example of all this is the Final Fantasy series. If you were a gamer growing up with these games in the US, you may have noticed that we had a Final Fantasy for the NES released in 1988. Then on the Super Nintendo we got Final Fantasy 2 in 1991 and Final Fantasy 3 in 1994. Then in 1997 we got on the PlayStation Final Fantasy VII. A lot of people got confused and were thinking, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, and 7? What happened to 4, 5, and 6? Well, here's the explanation. The other Final Fantasy games that are missing were only released in Japan, but they're not what you think they are. Final Fantasy 2, as it's known in the US, is actually Final Fantasy 4, and Final Fantasy 3, as it's known in the US, is actually Final Fantasy 6. So in reality, the three missing Final Fantasy games are 2, 3, and 5. They were never released in America until much later when all the Final Fantasy games were remade for the Game Boy Advance. Okay, I'm not a racist or anything, but why is it that Japan has to keep things so inconsistent with the Americans? Why do they get so much more stuff in the video game world that we in the US don't? That's actually quite impressive considering that Japan is a much smaller country than the US. And this concludes my rant. This is PP97 signing off.